Tonight we explore the quiet sensation of having lived a moment before, the brief flicker of recognition that fades almost as soon as it arrives. You've felt it, nearly everyone has. You walk into a room you've never entered, hear a sentence spoken for the first time, and something in the arrangement of light and sound and stillness hums with a strange, impossible familiarity. The room is new. The sentence is new. Your rational mind knows this with complete certainty. And yet the feeling persists, hovering there for 10 seconds, maybe 20, before it dissolves like breath on cold glass. That suspended flash has a name. It's French. Déjà vu, already seen. It's one of the most common neurological experiences reported by human beings across every culture and language on Earth, and also one of the most difficult to study, because it arrives without warning, lasts only seconds, and can't be reliably reproduced in a laboratory setting. But over the past several decades, neuroscientists have begun to take it apart, piece by piece, circuit by circuit. What they've found is that déjà vu is not a glitch in the soul, not evidence of a past life, not a crack in the fabric of time. It is a measurable event inside the brain, with identifiable neural signatures, specific anatomical origins, and a logic that connects it to the deepest systems of memory, spatial navigation, and pattern recognition that your mind uses every waking second of every day. Over the course of this recording, you'll gradually learn how the medial temporal lobe generates signals of familiarity. You'll hear how electrical stimulation of specific brain regions can produce the sensation on command. You'll follow researchers into virtual reality environments designed to trigger déjà vu under controlled conditions. And you'll discover how dreams, sleep deprivation, and the brain's own error correction systems all play a role in producing that strange, hovering feeling of recognition. 100 facts told slowly. Let your breathing settle. Let your eyes close if they want to. We begin where all explanations begin, with a definition. Déjà vu is a French phrase meaning already seen. It describes the specific sensation of feeling that a brand new experience has been lived through before, while you simultaneously know, with rational certainty, that it can't have been. Two signals exist in your mind at the same time: recognition and impossibility. Neither cancels the other out. They simply coexist for a few seconds until the feeling fades and ordinary perception resumes. The term was formally introduced into the psychological literature by the French philosopher Émile Boirac. He published it in 1876 in a book called L'Avenir des Sciences Psychiques, which translates roughly to the future of the psychic sciences. Boirac described it as a memory error, a moment in which awareness and memory fall briefly out of alignment. He didn't know what caused it, but he gave it a name, and that name has endured for nearly 150 years. Before Boirac, the phenomenon had been observed and discussed for more than half a century, but nobody had given it a consistent label. Philosophers and early psychologists called it paramnesia. Some used the phrase identifying paramnesia. Others simply described it as an illusion of memory, a momentary confusion between the present and something that felt like the past. The experience was familiar to nearly everyone who was asked about it, but it resisted any kind of systematic study because nobody could summon it on demand. William James wrote about it in 1890. In his textbook, The Principles of Psychology, he put it this way: there is a curious experience which everyone seems to have had, the feeling that the present moment in its completeness has been experienced before. That line is one of the earliest earliest formal English language discussions of the sensation. James didn't explain the mechanism. He simply observed that the experience was widespread and persistent across populations, and left it at that. The defining feature that separates déjà vu from an ordinary false memory is its dual quality. When you experience déjà vu, two things happen at once. You feel recognition. You feel the recognition is wrong. It isn't a delusion. A false memory just feels true. Déjà vu feels true and impossible at the exact same time, and that paradox is what makes the experience so distinctive. Over more than a century of scientific writing, researchers have cataloged at least 72 different proposed explanations for what causes déjà vu. About 50 of those were put forward before 1979. Another 22 came after. No single mechanism has been universally accepted, though in recent years the field has narrowed considerably around a few well-supported models. How common is it? About 60 to 70% of the general population report having experienced déjà vu at least once. A meta-analysis published in 2024 found an even higher figure, a pooled prevalence of roughly 74% across healthy individuals. That means about 3 out of every 4 people you've ever met have felt this sensation at some point in their life. It's not rare, it's ordinary. A separate 2024 study surveyed medical university students and found that 89.2% reported at least one episode. That same study found a measurable association between moderate to severe stress and the frequency of déjà vu episodes, with a p-value of 0.012. Stress, it turns out, doesn't just affect your mood. It changes how your memory systems behave. The phrase déjà vu itself is only the most recognizable term in a much larger family of related phenomena. In 1981, neuropsychiatrist Vernon Knepp completed a doctoral thesis enumerating 21 distinct variants of the déjà experience. Each describes a slightly different flavor of false recognition, a different way the brain's familiarity circuits can misfire. Déjà entendu means already heard. It describes the eerie sense that a phrase, a piece of music, or a spoken sentence has been heard before in exactly the same form, even though you're hearing it for the first time. The words arrive in your ears, and something inside you insists these exact words, in this exact sequence, have passed through your awareness before. The feeling can last a few seconds, then it's gone. Déjà vu is different, deeper, more immersive. It means already lived or already experienced. In this variant, you don't just feel a scene is familiar. You feel that you are genuinely reliving an entire unfolding situation, including a sense of knowing what will happen next. Déjà vu shows up prominently in certain neurological conditions, and when it persists, it can become distressing. But in its mild, passing form, it's a brief and harmless expansion of the ordinary déjà vu sensation. Déjà visité means already visited. It describes the sense of familiarity with a physical location, a building, a street, a stretch of countryside that you have never actually entered or seen before. You stand somewhere entirely new, and your brain tells you that you've stood in this spot before. Déjà vu is perhaps the most poetic variant. It means already dreamed. It describes the feeling that the present moment resembles the forgotten content of a previous dream, not a memory you can recall. A memory you can almost feel, hovering just beneath the surface of retrieval. Swiss psychologist Arthur Funkhauser proposed a simpler classification system for these overlapping experiences. He grouped them into déjà vu, the feeling of having lived through a situation; déjà senti, the feeling of having felt something before, primarily a mental event rather than a perceptual one; déjà visité, the feeling of having been to a place before, and left the remaining variants as subcategories within those groupings. The opposite of déjà vu also exists. It's called jamais vu, never seen. In jamais vu, a familiar object, word, or place loses its familiarity without warning. You look at a word you've written 1,000 times and it seems foreign. You walk into your own kitchen, and for a split second it feels like someone else's house. Researchers believe jamais vu arises when the brain's matching process between incoming sensory data and stored memories fails completely, rather than misfiring the way it does in déjà vu. If déjà vu is a false positive, jamais vu is a false negative. There's also presque vu, almost seen. You know it as the tip of the tongue state, that frustrating sensation of being on the verge of recalling something, a name, a word, a fact, that sits just outside your conscious reach. Ann Cleary, a cognitive psychologist at Colorado State University, whose research you'll hear much more about later, has described standard déjà vu as functioning in a similar way. The memory is there. It exists somewhere in the brain's storage systems, but it sits just beyond the threshold of conscious retrieval, close enough to generate a feeling of recognition, too far away to actually be grasped. These first observations describe what déjà vu feels like and how widely it has been reported across populations and across centuries. The next group of facts looks at where in the brain this sensation originates and how it connects to the fundamental architecture of human memory. The medial temporal lobe is the primary anatomical site linked to déjà vu. It sits deep within the temporal lobes on both sides of the brain, curving along the inner surface near the midline. Within it, you'll find the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, the parahinal cortex, and the parahippocampal gyrus. These four structures are wired densely to one another. Together, they form the essential machinery for declarative memory, the kind of memory that lets you consciously recall facts and personal experiences. Everything you deliberately remember about your life passes through this region at some point. Information flows through these structures in a specific sequence. Sensory data from the outside world, the sight of a face, the sound of a voice, the geometry of a room, arrives first at the parahinal and parahippocampal cortices. From there it passes through the entorhinal cortex, which acts as a kind of gateway. From the entorhinal cortex, the signal reaches the hippocampal formation, which sends its own output projections outward through a bundle of nerve fibers called the fornix. Each stage processes the information differently, adding layers of context and association as the signal moves deeper into the system. The hippocampus handles recollection. When you remember not just that something happened, but when it happened, where it happened, and the web of association surrounding it, that's the hippocampus at work. It encodes the rich, contextual fabric of episodic memory. The specific afternoon, the particular room, the expression on a particular face. The parahinal and entorhinal cortices handle something else, something faster and less detailed. Together, these regions, sometimes grouped under the term rhinal cortex, are responsible for familiarity, the bare sense that something has been encountered before, independent of your ability to retrieve any specific memory about it. This familiarity signal can fire without the hippocampus ever producing a source memory. You feel that you know something. You can't say why or when or where. That gap between knowing and knowing why is where déjà vu lives. This distinction between familiarity and recollection forms the foundation of what researchers call the dual process model of recognition memory. It was formalized by Eagleton and Brown in 1999 and refined by Montaldi and Mays in 2010. Under this model, the two processes are anatomically separate, handled by different structures in the medial temporal lobe, and when they fall out of alignment, déjà vu can result. Here's what happens during déjà vu, according to this model. The brain's familiarity signal fires. It tells you the current scene is known, that you've encountered this arrangement of the world before, but the recollection system fails to retrieve any matching source memory. No context, no time stamp, no associated episode. The brain is certain this is familiar and simultaneously unable to find the original encounter. That mismatch is the core neurological signature of the experience. Functional MRI studies of patients with rhinal cortex abnormalities support this picture directly. Damage to the rhinal cortex selectively impairs familiarity-based recognition, while recollection may remain relatively intact. And the probability of déjà vu increases precisely in cases where familiarity processing is disrupted. The system that generates the "I've seen this before" signal is the same system that, when it misfires, produces the experience. In 2004, a team led by Fabrice Bartolomé at Timon Hospital in Marseille published a landmark study in the journal Neurology. They examined 24 epilepsy patients who had been implanted with stereotactically guided intracerebral electrodes, thin probes inserted directly into the brain to pinpoint the source of seizures. The team performed 280 direct cortical stimulations and carefully documented what each patient reported. Stimulation of the entorhinal cortex produced déjà vu most frequently. Stimulation of the parahynal cortex was more often associated with memory reminiscence, the recall of specific past experiences, rather than the vague blanket of familiarity that defines déjà vu. Two adjacent regions, two different flavors of memory response. Bartolomé's team published a follow-up in 2012 in Clinical Neurophysiology. This time they analyzed something more subtle, the synchronization of electrical signals between the rhinal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala during the moments when déjà vu was artificially induced. They found increased theta band coupling between the rhinal cortex and hippocampus during déjà vu episodes. The p-value was 0.01. During stimulations that didn't produce déjà vu, this coupling was absent. Theta band coupling refers to the synchronized oscillation of neural populations at a frequency between roughly 4 and 8 Hz, a slow, rhythmic pulse of coordinated activity. When two brain regions show theta coupling, they are, in effect, communicating at the same tempo. The finding suggests that déjà vu isn't just the familiarity system misfiring in isolation. It reflects transient cooperation between multiple medial temporal lobe structures, a brief, anomalous moment in which the familiarity signal and the recollection monitoring system are both active at the same time, without resolution. Temporal lobe epilepsy provides the clearest clinical window into the neural origins of déjà vu. Patients with this form of epilepsy frequently report déjà vu as part of their seizure aura, the warning sensations that precede a focal seizure. For these patients, the feeling of having been here before isn't a curiosity. It's a signal that a seizure is approaching. A 2024 meta-analysis found that ictal déjà vu, meaning déjà vu occurring as a component of a seizure, is experienced by about 22% of epilepsy patients. The 95% confidence interval ranged from 15 to 32%. The highest rates were found in patients with familial medial temporal lobe epilepsy, a hereditary form of the condition that affects the same deep brain structures involved in memory encoding. Ictal déjà vu feels different from the everyday kind. It tends to be more emotionally negative, more often accompanied by fear and derealization, the unsettling sense that the world around you isn't quite real. It typically lasts longer. Healthy déjà vu, by contrast, is usually accompanied by neutral or mildly positive affect, a flicker of strangeness, a quiet huh, then it's gone. The clinical version and the everyday version share the same neural architecture, but the intensity, duration, and emotional coloring are distinct. Wilder Penfield was the first to show that déjà vu could be produced on command. Penfield was a Canadian neurosurgeon and the director of the Montreal Neurological Institute. Beginning in 1938, he performed awake brain surgeries on epilepsy patients, stimulating different regions of the cortex with gentle electrical probes, while the patients remained fully conscious and able to describe what they felt. When he stimulated the lateral temporal neocortex, particularly the superior temporal gyrus, patients reported vivid memory-like experiences, feelings of familiarity, and classic déjà vu. Penfield called this area the interpretive cortex. He had found a physical address for a feeling that had, until then, been considered purely subjective and unmeasurable. In the 1990s, Bancaud and colleagues refined Penfield's work. They studied 16 temporal lobe epilepsy patients with implanted electrodes and carried out 43 stimulations. Their results shifted the map. The dreamy state, encompassing both déjà vu and vivid memory hallucinations, was most reliably evoked from the medial temporal structures rather than the lateral cortex Penfield had originally targeted. The deeper you went, the more reliably you could produce the sensation. In 2014, Pierre Magevan and colleagues published a case study in the Journal of Neuroscience that added another layer. They described a 22-year-old patient implanted with stereo EEG electrodes. When they applied direct bipolar stimulation to electrodes sitting in the collateral sulcus and medial fusiform gyrus, a region overlapping with the parahippocampal place area, the patient reported two simultaneous things: a strong sensation of déjà vu and a topographic visual hallucination. He saw a street from his own neighborhood. The patient said the induced sensation was identical to his usual seizure auras. The artificial stimulation was replicating the exact same neural process as naturally occurring déjà vu in that individual. When the team stimulated the amygdala and entorhinal cortex in the same patient, they also produced déjà vu, but without the visual component. The familiarity was there. The image was not. The frontal lobes add a supervisory dimension to this whole process. In 2016, Akira O'Connor at the University of St. Andrews used functional MRI to image volunteers experiencing experimentally induced déjà vu. He triggered the sensation using the Dees-Roediger-McDermott false memory method, a well-established technique in which participants hear lists of related words and later falsely recognize words that were never actually presented. The results were surprising. The hippocampus was not the primary active region during the déjà vu moment. Instead, the anterior cingulate cortex, The medial prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex showed the strongest activation. These are frontal monitoring regions, the brain's internal fact checkers. O'Connor's interpretation changed how many researchers think about this sensation. He proposed that déjà vu may be the brain's own error detection signal. The frontal monitoring system registers a conflict between the familiarity signal, which says this is known, and the contextual evidence, which says this is new. The frontal cortex flags the mismatch and delivers it to your conscious awareness as that hovering sense of recognition. In O'Connor's framing, déjà vu might actually indicate that the brain's fact-checking process is working, not failing. These facts describe the brain regions involved in generating familiarity signals and the frontal systems that monitor their accuracy. The next section explores how the spatial geometry of the world around you, the shape of rooms and streets and open spaces, may trigger déjà vu through a process called pattern matching. Anne Cleary is a cognitive psychologist at Colorado State University. She has spent more than a decade developing what she calls the Gestalt familiarity hypothesis. Her proposal is specific. Déjà vu isn't triggered by a remembered object or face or word. It is triggered by the overall spatial configuration of a scene that matches a configuration already stored in memory. The match doesn't need to be exact. It just needs to be close enough to fire the brain's familiarity circuit. The word Gestalt matters here. It means whole form. The hypothesis holds that the entire spatial arrangement of elements within a scene, the relative positions of objects, their distances, their proportions, generates a single, holistic familiarity signal, even when the individual objects are completely different from anything the brain has seen before. A new room can feel familiar not because of anything inside it, but because of the shape of the space itself. In 2012, Cleary and colleagues published a foundational study in the journal Consciousness and Cognition. Participants wore head-mounted virtual reality displays and were immersed in a three-dimensional virtual village. The environment was built using the life simulation game The Sims 2. Cleary named it Déjà vu. The environment contained 128 scenes divided into secretly matched pairs. Each pair consisted of 2 scenes with identical spatial layouts, meaning the positions of objects on a three-dimensional grid were the same, but the surface details were completely different. Different textures, different colors, different objects entirely. One scene might be a museum. Its secret twin might be a courtyard. The walls were different. The furniture was different. The only thing shared was the invisible skeleton of spatial geometry underneath. Consider a specific example. A virtual museum scene might share its exact spatial configuration with an earlier courtyard scene. The distance from a central element to flanking objects, the relative positions of benches and a focal feature all matched. But the museum held a statue and artwork. The courtyard had a potted plant and shrubbery. If you looked at the 2 scenes side by side, you wouldn't think they were related. But strip away the surfaces and the underlying architecture was the same. The results confirmed Cleary's hypothesis. Déjà vu reports and familiarity ratings were measurably higher when the new scene matched a prior scene in spatial layout, compared to scenes that were completely novel. And this effect was strongest in cases where participants couldn't consciously recall the previously viewed counterpart scene. The familiarity was real. The source of it was hidden. This captures something essential about déjà vu, something that explains why the experience feels so strange. The sense of familiarity is grounded in a genuine partial match between the present scene and a stored memory. The match exists. The brain's detection of it is accurate, but the source can't be consciously retrieved. As Cleary herself has explained, just because something fails to be recalled doesn't mean the memory isn't still in there somewhere. The memory is present. It's just below the surface of conscious access. The brain region most closely tied to processing these spatial configurations is the parahippocampal place area, or PPA. It's a region of the parahippocampal gyrus that responds more strongly to scenes depicting places than to any other kind of visual stimulus. More than faces, more than objects, more than words. When you walk into a room, the PPA encodes the layout. Here's the thing about the PPA. It processes scene geometry based primarily on fixed background elements. The shape of a room, the arrangement of walls, the positions of windows and doors, not the movable objects, not the chairs or the cups on the table, the spatial skeleton underneath. This means the PPA can generate a familiarity signal for a space even when all the furniture has been changed. The room feels familiar because the room itself is familiar, even if everything inside it is new. A closely related region called the retrosplenial cortex plays a complementary role. Where the PPA represents the local scene, the geometry of the room you're standing in, the retrosplenial cortex represents that room's position within a broader cognitive map. It links your current location to other locations you've visited. It places you in the world. Together, the PPA and the retrosplenial cortex build a layered representation of space that operates below conscious awareness, continuously, every moment you're awake. The PPA's response to scene layout doesn't depend on whether you consciously recognize the place. It fires before conscious recognition occurs. This temporal gap, the brief interval in which the spatial familiarity signal has been generated but conscious identification hasn't yet arrived, is precisely the window in which a déjà vu experience may form. The feeling arrives before the explanation, and sometimes the explanation never comes at all. In 2018, Cleary and former graduate student Alexander Claxton published a follow-up using the same Sims virtual environments. This time they asked a different question. When people experience déjà vu, they often feel a sense of premonition, a feeling that they know what will happen next. Is that feeling accurate? No. Participants who experienced déjà vu during the virtual reality navigation often felt they could predict what they would see around the next corner, but their predictions were no better than chance. The feeling of knowing was convincing. The actual knowledge was entirely absent. This result matters because it separates the feeling of knowing from actual knowledge. The sense of premonition is a byproduct of the familiarity signal, not evidence of genuine predictive ability. Your brain detects a match. The match triggers familiarity. The familiarity spills over into a broader feeling of foreknowledge, but the foreknowledge is hollow. It's confidence without content. The entorhinal cortex adds another layer to this story. It houses grid cells, neurons that fire in hexagonal, tessellating patterns as you move through space. These cells provide the brain's coordinate system for spatial navigation. They don't encode landmarks or specific objects. They encode position, your position relative to the geometry of the space around you. And they use not just visual information, but multisensory bodily signals to maintain this internal map. Grid cells in the entorhinal cortex interact continuously with place cells in the hippocampus. Place cells fire when you're in a specific location. This corner, that doorway, the spot by the window. The grid cells provide the spatial metric, the coordinate framework. The place cells provide the specific location code. Together they maintain a running model of where you are at any given moment. When a new environment activates a spatial pattern similar to one that's already stored, the grid place cell system may generate a familiarity signal without triggering full recollection. The coordinates match, the location doesn't, and the brain registers a feeling of recognition without a matching memory to go with it. In a 2025 essay published in the magazine Ian, Cleary described a further refinement of her experimental approach, the virtual tour method. Participants watched first-person video tour of rooms that shared layouts with previously viewed rooms. The paths through these rooms were identical to paths in earlier counterpart rooms. And as a participant approached a turn that had appeared in the earlier room, the sense of déjà vu intensified. The match was strongest at the turn. The feeling of premonition about which direction the path would go also peaked at that point. But once again, the premonition wasn't accurate. The feeling of knowing which way the path turned was no better than a coin flip. Even in its most intense moment, the predictive sense produced by déjà vu carried no real information. The Gestalt familiarity hypothesis also explains a pattern that researchers have noticed for decades. Déjà vu is disproportionately triggered by places, not by faces, not by objects, not by individual words, places. This makes sense under Cleary's model. Spatial configurations are encoded holistically by the parahippocampal and entorhinal systems. Your brain doesn't store a room as a list of objects. It stores the room as a shape, and shapes overlap more easily than discrete items do. A museum and a courtyard can share a layout. Two individual coffee cups can't share the same kind of structural skeleton. Cleary's hypothesis generates a testable prediction about who should experience déjà vu most often. If the sensation is triggered by partial spatial overlaps between current scenes and stored scenes, then people who encounter more novel environments should have more opportunities for these overlaps. They should experience déjà vu more frequently. And the data supports this. People who travel more, who walk into more unfamiliar buildings, navigate more unfamiliar streets, enter more new rooms, report more déjà vu episodes. More new spaces means more chances for the brain to detect a ghostly match with a space from the past. The similarity effect also works on a sliding scale. As the number of matching spatial cues between a new scene and a stored memory increases, the subjective impression of familiarity increases proportionally. Déjà vu sits at a specific point on this curve. The match is strong enough to trigger a familiarity signal, but too oblique, too partial, to trigger conscious recognition of the original source. Below that threshold, you feel nothing out of the ordinary. Above it, you simply remember. Déjà vu occupies the narrow band in between. Cleary's body of work bridges laboratory cognitive science and clinical neurology. It confirms a core prediction of dual process models, that déjà vu results when familiarity fires in the absence of recollection, driven by real underlying memory matches that the conscious mind simply can't surface. The feeling isn't a phantom, it's a real signal. The mystery is only that the source remains hidden. These observations connect déjà vu to how the brain maps the physical space around you. The next group of facts examines how timing errors in neural processing, tiny delays measured in fractions of a second, may also contribute to the experience. The split perception theory proposes something deceptively simple. A single, continuous experience can feel like two separate events. The mechanism works like this. If your attention is briefly divided or distracted during the first instant you encounter a scene, the brain begins forming a weak, incomplete memory trace of that scene. A fraction of a second later, your full attention snaps into focus. You perceive the same scene again, but now a neural trace from that distracted first glance already exists in the brain's memory system. The second perception feels like a memory, because, in a very real neurological sense, it is one. From the perspective of your conscious experience, a single event feels like two, one remembered, one happening now. The brain has encoded two slightly different versions of the same sensory input at different levels of attentional engagement. The gap between them is invisible to you. All you feel is the eerie sense that this moment has occurred before. A related model is the neural transmission delay hypothesis, proposed by neurophysiology researcher Robert Efron. His idea was that when sensory information travels along one of the brain's perceptual pathways and passes through an area of transient disruption, a brief slowing, a momentary impairment, it may arrive at its destination with an abnormal delay. The brain then logs the same perceptual event twice, once at normal speed, once late. And the late arrival gets processed as if it were a separate, earlier event. The delay involved is extraordinarily small. Researchers have described the error as potentially on the order of roughly 1 millisecond, 1,000th of a second, a gap invisible to conscious experience. But your brain's temporal tagging system is sensitive enough to register this difference and flag the same event as two separate occurrences. Your conscious mind experiences a strange doubling, a feeling of repetition where none exists. Information from the environment reaches the brain through multiple sensory pathways at once, and these routes are not all equally fast. Visual information takes one path, auditory information takes another. Proprioceptive signals from your body take a third and a fourth. When the arriving signal from one pathway reaches the processing centers slightly ahead of the signal from another, the second arrival may be processed not as a continuation of the same event, but as an echo of a memory. Two perceptions of one moment, one present, one apparently past. Alan Brown published a landmark review paper in Psychological Bulletin in 2003. It remains among the most cited works in the déjà vu literature. Brown classified the proposed mechanisms into four categories. Dual processing errors, where two cognitive processes that normally operate together fall out of alignment. Neurological disruptions, where electrical or chemical abnormalities in the temporal lobe produce false familiarity. Implicit memory activation, where a forgotten prior exposure to a similar scene generates unconscious recognition. And attentional gaps, where a momentary lapse in attention creates the split perception effect. Each of these categories maps onto one or more of the models described in this recording. None has been definitively proven as the single cause. The current view in the field is that déjà vu likely arises from multiple converging mechanisms rather than any single source. The prefrontal cortex doesn't generate the familiarity signal. That arises deeper in the brain, in the rhinal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex monitors the accuracy of memory signals and compares them against the known context. When the familiarity signal doesn't match what the prefrontal monitoring system expects to find in memory, when the signal says known but the context says new, a conflict alert is generated. That conflict alert is what you feel as déjà vu. O'Connor's 2016 fMRI study confirmed this. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region known to detect cognitive conflict and signal the need for corrective action, was strongly active during déjà vu episodes. This activation pattern mirrors what the anterior cingulate does during other forms of conflict monitoring. It's the same region that lights up when you encounter contradictory information, when you catch yourself making an error, when two pieces of evidence point in opposite directions. Déjà vu activates the brain's error detection circuitry, not its memory system. The implication runs counter to what you might expect. Déjà vu may actually be a sign that the brain's memory checking system is functioning well, not that it's broken. The frontal monitoring system detects a genuine error. The familiarity signal is firing without a legitimate source and raises a conscious alert. You experience that alert as the hovering feeling of recognition, but the feeling is actually a correction. The brain is telling itself that something about this familiarity doesn't add up. Dopamine connects to this story through its role in threshold sensitivity. Dopamine is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the temporal lobe circuits that generate familiarity signals. When dopamine activity is elevated, whether from stress, from medication, or from spontaneous fluctuation, it can lower the threshold at which the familiarity signal fires. Things that would normally feel neutral begin to feel known. The bar for recognition drops. A documented case illustrates this with unusual clarity. A man was taking a combination of two medications, amantadine, an antiviral drug, and phenylpropanolamine, a decongestant. Both compounds increase dopamine and noradrenaline activity in the brain. While taking both drugs at the same time, the man experienced several déjà vu episodes per hour. When the medications were discontinued, the déjà vu stopped completely. His familiarity system had been chemically sensitized to fire at the slightest provocation, and once the chemical push was removed, the misfiring ceased. Stress and fatigue reliably increase the frequency of déjà vu. The most likely explanation is that fatigue degrades the prefrontal monitoring system's ability to distinguish genuine familiarity from errant signals. When the brain is tired, the error detection system becomes both more sensitive and less precise. It flags more events as conflicts. It generates more false alarms. And those false alarms reach your conscious awareness more frequently as déjà vu. The 2024 medical student study supports this connection directly. Students reporting moderate to severe stress had statistically higher rates of déjà vu than their less stressed peers, with a p-value of 0.012. The correlation held even when other factors were controlled for. Chronic stress, it seems, doesn't just exhaust you emotionally. It changes how your memory systems interpret the world. The age profile of déjà vu is distinctive. Interesting, even. The experience peaks in frequency between the ages of roughly 15 and 25. After that, it gradually declines across the lifespan. Young adults report it most often. Older adults report it less. This pattern may reflect the maturation and eventual strengthening of the prefrontal monitoring systems. During adolescence and early adulthood, these systems are still developing, not yet fully calibrated. The threshold for detecting memory conflicts may be set lower, producing more déjà vu. As the frontal cortex matures and its monitoring becomes more refined, the false alarms decrease. The system gets better at telling the difference between genuine familiarity and errant signals. These facts describe the timing and attention errors that may underlie the sensation, and the way the brain's conflict monitoring systems flag them for conscious awareness. The next section looks at how déjà vu connects to something you may experience tonight: sleep, and specifically, how dreams, memory consolidation, and the quiet work the brain performs in the dark may all contribute to the feeling of having been here before. Many people who experience déjà vu report that the familiar moment resembles a scene from a dream, not a dream they can clearly recall, a dream they almost remember, a fragment, a spatial arrangement, a feeling of place that hovers just beneath the surface of memory, close enough to generate recognition but too faint to be retrieved. This report is common enough that researchers have given it serious attention, and the neuroscience of dreaming offers a plausible explanation for why it might occur. During REM sleep, the hippocampus replays and recombines spatial and emotional memories from the preceding day. It doesn't replay them faithfully, it mixes them. It takes the layout of one room and the emotional tone of another experience and the face of a person from a third memory, and combines them into a novel composite scene that never actually happened. This is the raw material of dreams, recombined fragments of waking life assembled into new configurations every night. Most of these dream composites are never stored as retrievable memories. You wake up and the dream is gone. Within 5 minutes of opening your eyes, the content has faded. Within 10 minutes, most of it is irrecoverable. The hippocampus generated the scene. The cortex never consolidated it into a durable trace. But here's what some researchers propose. The spatial configuration of that dream, the shape of the room, the arrangement of objects, the geometry of the scene, may leave behind a partial, unconscious trace. Not a memory you can access, a residue, a ghost pattern in the neural architecture of the parahippocampal place area. Then days or weeks later, you walk into a real room whose spatial layout happens to match the layout of that forgotten dream. The PPA detects the match. The familiarity signal fires, but there's no source memory to retrieve because the dream was never consolidated into a form your conscious mind can access. You feel that you've been here before. You can't say when or why. And the answer, a dream you'll never remember, sits just out of reach forever. This isn't the dominant theory of déjà vu, but it offers a compelling explanation for a specific subset of déjà vu experiences, the ones that feel most dream-like, the ones that carry a particular quality of softness and strangeness, as though the familiar moment belongs to a different mode of consciousness entirely, one you visited in sleep and can never quite return to while awake. The relationship between sleep quality and déjà vu frequency has been documented in several studies. People who sleep fewer hours tend to report more déjà vu episodes. This could reflect the fatigue effect described earlier. Less sleep means a more degraded prefrontal monitoring system, more false alarms, more errant familiarity signals reaching awareness. But it could also reflect something about the quality of memory consolidation itself. When sleep is shortened or disrupted, the processes that normally strengthen important memories and discard unimportant ones don't complete their full cycle. More partial traces survive. More incomplete patterns remain in storage, and more of these fragments become available to generate false matches with waking perception. Memory consolidation during slow-wave sleep is selective. The brain doesn't preserve everything from the day. It strengthens some traces and weakens others. Memories that were emotionally charged, rehearsed, or connected to existing knowledge get consolidated, Memories that were fleeting, incidental, or unprocessed get pruned. But the pruning isn't perfect. Some partial patterns survive. A spatial layout without its associated context. A feeling without its associated scene. These orphaned fragments persist in the neural architecture and can surface later as the raw material for déjà vu, familiarity signals without source memories to anchor them. REM sleep adds another dimension. During REM, the brain generates novel scene composites, new arrangements of stored spatial and emotional material. These composites are experienced as dreams. Most are forgotten within minutes of waking, but the spatial patterns they contain may persist as unconscious traces in the parahippocampal and entorhinal systems. Over days and weeks, these traces accumulate. A library of forgotten spatial layouts, filed away in a region of the brain that specializes in detecting familiar geometry. Each one is a potential match, waiting to be triggered by the right real-world scene. Lucid dreamers, people who become aware that they are dreaming while the dream continues, report higher rates of déjà vu in their waking life. This correlation has been observed in several studies. It may reflect a shared underlying trait, heightened metacognitive monitoring. People who are more aware of their own mental states during sleep may also be more aware of the familiarity conflict signals that produce déjà vu during waking hours. Some researchers have proposed a direct link between the hippocampal replay that occurs during sleep and the familiarity misfires that produce déjà vu. The hippocampus replays compressed versions of the day's spatial experiences during slow-wave sleep, fast-forward renditions of paths walked, rooms entered, corridors navigated. These compressed replays are believed to facilitate the transfer of memories from the hippocampus to the neocortex for long-term storage. If this replay process is incomplete or imprecise, if the compressed version captures the spatial skeleton of an experience but loses its contextual details, the result could be a stored spatial pattern stripped of its source information. A layout without a label, a match without a memory. People who take naps report slightly different patterns of déjà vu compared to people who don't. Napping introduces an additional cycle of memory consolidation in the middle of the day, a partial reorganization of stored material, while new experiences are still being accumulated. This midday consolidation could create more opportunities for partial patterns to form, and more opportunities for those patterns to encounter matching scenes on the same day. The temperature of the brain during sleep fluctuates in ways that affect memory processing. During slow-wave sleep, brain temperature drops slightly. During REM sleep, it rises. These thermal fluctuations influence the efficiency of synaptic transmission and may affect which traces are strengthened and which are lost. Tiny variations in this process, from night to night, could alter how many partial patterns remain available to trigger déjà vu on any given day. People with anxiety disorders report higher rates of déjà vu than the general population. Anxiety elevates baseline arousal in the amygdala, which sits adjacent to the hippocampus and rhinal cortex in the medial temporal lobe. Elevated amygdala activity could lower the threshold for familiarity signals in the neighboring cortex, making the system more prone to false positive recognition. The anxious brain is, quite literally, a more déjà vu-prone brain. Meditation practices also appear to influence déjà vu frequency, though the research here is limited. Long-term meditators, including Buddhist monks who practice for thousands of hours, develop altered patterns of neural activity in the medial temporal lobe and prefrontal cortex. These are the same regions implicated in déjà vu generation and monitoring. Whether this altered activity increases or decreases the frequency of déjà vu remains an open question, but the overlap in neural territory is worth noting. Monks who reach the deepest stages of concentration meditation report a heightened awareness of their own mental states, a sharpened ability to observe the arising and passing of thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. If déjà vu is partly a product of frontal conflict monitoring, then a brain trained to monitor its own processes with unusual precision might detect more of these conflicts, or fewer, depending on how the monitoring is calibrated. The connection between sleep and déjà vu points to something fundamental about how memory works. Memory is not a recording. It is a dynamic, ongoing process of consolidation, recombination, and selective forgetting. Sleep is when much of this process occurs quietly, without your awareness, in the dark. And déjà vu is one of the small, visible artifacts of that hidden work. A moment when the seams show. When the machinery of memory briefly becomes visible to the conscious mind before disappearing again. These observations connect déjà vu to the quiet work the brain performs during sleep and to the way emotional states modulate the memory systems that produce the experience. The final group of facts places this small sensation within the larger context of memory, culture, and what déjà vu tells us about the nature of perception itself. Déjà vu has been documented across cultures worldwide, described in many languages with similar phenomenological features. In Japanese, the term is kishiken, written Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, which translates directly to already seen feeling. German speakers use the French phrase or the compound déjà vu erlebnis. Portuguese and Arabic contain comparable terms. The experience is not culturally constructed. It is neurologically generated, a product of brain architecture shared across the human species. The cross-cultural consistency of descriptions is striking. Whether the person reporting it lives in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Cairo, or Oslo, the core features are the same. A sense of familiarity with a novel experience. The simultaneous knowledge that the familiarity is false. A duration of seconds. A feeling that is difficult to put into words but instantly recognized by anyone who has ever had it. The consistency suggests a single underlying mechanism, a common neural process producing a common subjective experience regardless of language, culture, or belief system. The correlation between travel and déjà vu, predicted by Cleary's Gestalt familiarity hypothesis, has been confirmed by survey data. People who travel more frequently, who expose themselves to more novel environments and unfamiliar buildings, report more frequent déjà vu experiences. Each new space is an opportunity for the brain to detect a partial match with a stored spatial layout. More spaces means more matches. More matches means more déjà vu. Young children rarely report déjà vu. The experience is largely absent before the age of 8 or 9 and remains uncommon until early adolescence. The most likely explanation is developmental. The prefrontal monitoring systems that detect the conflict between familiarity and novelty are among the last brain systems to mature. They don't reach full functionality until the late teens or early 20s. A young child's brain may generate errant familiarity signals just as an adult's does, but without a mature conflict monitoring system to flag them, the child never becomes consciously aware of the mismatch. The signal fires and dissipates without ever reaching the level of conscious experience. The the feeling never registers. Chronic déjà vu is a rare but documented clinical condition. In chronic déjà vu, the feeling of false familiarity persists for hours, days, or even longer. It is associated with temporal lobe dysfunction, damage, or abnormal electrical activity in the medial temporal structures that generate the familiarity signal. For patients with this condition, the world becomes saturated with false recognition. Every room feels visited. Every conversation feels repeated. One clinical case described an elderly man who stopped watching television because he felt he had already seen every program. He stopped reading the newspaper because every article felt like one he'd already read. His familiarity system was locked in the on position, continuously generating recognition signals regardless of whether the input was actually new or old. The conflict monitoring system in his frontal cortex couldn't override the signal. He lived inside a permanent loop of false recognition, unable to distinguish the new from the already known. Blind individuals also report déjà vu. This confirms that the experience is not exclusively visual. People who have been blind from birth describe déjà vu in terms of auditory, tactile, and spatial familiarity, the sense that a particular combination of sounds, textures, and spatial proportions has been encountered before. The French phrase means already seen, but the phenomenon itself is multimodal. It operates on whatever sensory information the brain has available. Déjà vu frequency appears to correlate with education level and socioeconomic status in some survey data. People with higher education and higher income report more frequent déjà vu. This correlation is likely confounded by travel frequency, vocabulary for describing internal experiences, and willingness to report unusual mental events. It probably doesn't reflect a fundamental difference in brain function. It reflects a difference in exposure and self-reporting. The emotional tone of déjà vu varies across individuals and episodes. Most healthy people describe the feeling as neutral, a brief moment of strangeness that passes quickly. Some find it mildly pleasant, a small puzzle, a fleeting curiosity. A smaller number find it unsettling, particularly if it occurs frequently or lasts longer than usual. The emotional coloring depends partly on temperament, partly on the context in which it occurs, and partly on whether the person interprets the experience as meaningful or merely odd. Some researchers have explored whether déjà vu can be induced by music. Certain melodic patterns, particularly those that follow familiar harmonic progressions in unfamiliar arrangements, appear to trigger feelings of auditory déjà vu, the sense that you've heard this specific piece of music before even when you haven't. The mechanism is analogous to the spatial version. The brain detects a structural similarity, a familiar harmonic skeleton in an unfamiliar surface, and generates a recognition signal without a retrievable source. People who remember their dreams more often report more déjà vu. This correlation has been observed in multiple studies and supports the hypothesis that dream-generated spatial composites serve as a reservoir of partial patterns available for false matching with waking experience. If you remember your dreams more, you may also encode more dream-derived spatial patterns, providing more potential match targets for your waking perception to stumble across. Dissociative experiences, moments of feeling detached from your own body or surroundings, also correlate with déjà vu frequency. People who score higher on measures of dissociation report more frequent déjà vu. The connection may involve shared neural substrates in the temporal parietal junction and medial temporal lobe. or it may reflect a broader tendency toward altered states of perceptual monitoring. The relationship is real. The mechanism is still being explored. Déjà vu episodes are slightly more common in the evening than in the morning. This timing effect may reflect the accumulation of fatigue across the day, a gradual degradation of prefrontal monitoring accuracy that increases the likelihood of familiarity misfires. By evening, the brain has been running its error detection systems for 16 hours straight. The system is tired, its thresholds are lower, and more errant signals slip through to conscious awareness. The experience is more commonly reported in indoor environments than outdoor ones. Rooms, hallways, offices, and shops are the most frequently cited settings. This aligns with Cleary's hypothesis. Indoor spaces have more constrained and repeatable spatial geometries than outdoor spaces do. Two rooms are more likely to share a layout than two forests or two mountain passes. The regularity of built environments creates more opportunities for the kind of partial spatial overlap that triggers the familiarity signal. Déjà vu is a window into something deep about how memory works. It reveals that memory is not a faithful recording of events. It is a reconstruction. Every time you recall something, your brain doesn't play back a stored file. It reassembles the memory from fragments, spatial patterns from one system, emotional coloring from another, contextual details from a third, sensory textures from a fourth. The fragments are distributed across multiple brain regions and must be gathered and woven together each time you remember. Déjà vu is what happens when one fragment, the spatial layout, the familiarity signal, activates without the others. You get recognition without context, familiarity without source, a single thread without the weave. And this is perhaps the most important thing déjà vu teaches us about the mind. Your experience of the present moment is never purely present. Every perception is a mixture of sensation and prediction. The brain is always running slightly ahead of the current moment, using stored patterns to anticipate what will happen next. It predicts the next word in a sentence before the speaker finishes it. It predicts the shape of the room around the corner before you turn. It predicts the weight of the cup before your hand lifts it from the table. Déjà vu is a moment when this predictive machinery briefly misfires. The prediction matches too closely to the actual input, and the brain interprets its own prediction as a memory. The present feels like the past because, for a fraction of a second, the brain's model of the present was built entirely from the past. As sleep approaches now, consider this. The same neural systems that produced any déjà vu you've ever experienced are preparing to do their nightly work. The hippocampus is getting ready to replay the spatial experiences of your day, compressing them, recombining them, filing the important ones and letting the rest dissolve. The entorhinal cortex will continue running its grid cell coordinate system even in sleep, mapping the remembered spaces of your waking life onto abstract spatial grids. The rhinal cortex will continue its background work of tagging things as known or unknown, familiar or new. In slow-wave sleep, your brain will strengthen certain memory traces and weaken others. It will decide which spatial layouts to keep and which to let go. Some of tonight's traces will be incomplete, spatial skeletons without context, feelings of place without specific content. These orphaned fragments will join the archive of partial patterns that your parahippocampal place area already holds, accumulated over years of entering rooms, walking down hallways, standing in doorways, passing through the built geometry of your life. And on some future day, you may walk into a room you've never entered and feel a quiet, strange certainty that you've been there before. The feeling will last 10 seconds, maybe 20. It won't be supernatural. It won't be a message from a past life or a tear in the fabric of reality. It will be a signal from your own brain, a signal that a real match has been detected between the present scene and a stored pattern, and that the source of that pattern can't be found. A fragment of memory surfacing without its context, a recognition without an origin. Billions of synapses are adjusting their connections right now in the quiet tissue of your brain, strengthening some pathways, weakening others, building the patterns that will shape tomorrow's perceptions and tomorrow's recognitions and tomorrow's small, strange moments of familiarity in rooms you've never entered before. The work happens in the dark. It happens without your awareness. It happens every night. And when déjà vu comes again, when the feeling arrives, soft and strange and impossible, you'll know a little more about what it is. A flicker of recognition from your own memory system, a signal from deep in the medial temporal lobe, a moment when the hidden work of pattern and prediction briefly surfaces into the light of conscious awareness. Then it fades like it always does, and the brain returns to its quiet work, sorting, compressing, predicting, rebuilding the model of the world that will greet you when you wake. Let your breathing slow. Let the facts settle. The brain is doing its work now. It needs no instructions. It knows what to keep and what to release. The night is quiet. The patterns are forming. And somewhere in the architecture of sleep, the fragments of today are finding their places. In the long, slow library of everything you've ever seen.